that libertarianism cannot stand up to this. But that to me is like ridiculous. Like he just made the libertarian argument for why libertarians should oppose all of this stuff. Now, it's almost like you have to kind of separate in a way, like the philosophy and the strategy. Like what's the kind of like philosophically correct answer? And then if you accept that, you go, okay, well, how do we move toward that now? How do we, like, what strategy do we put in place to try to figure that out? But the idea of libertarianism, like libertarianism doesn't stand up to anything. And neither does conservatism or populism or progressivism. Like there's no ism that stands up to anything. Ideas don't stand up to things. People have to stand up to things. People have to put strategies into place to go stand up to something. But if you're just talking about libertarianism, can't answer the problem that government is in bed with these private companies and is like kind of outsourcing tyranny to them. It's like, well, yeah, of course it can. In theory, like, yeah, the answer is stop doing that. Is repeal all of these policies, abolish all of these policies for the government to be in bed with all of these private actors. And the truth is that the government, the reason why the government has to intervene to get these companies to do all of these things is because they wouldn't under pure market conditions. So so to me, it's just like, this is something I see very like kind of, I see this as like a lot of right wingers kind of like take this attitude, but it's almost like step one, point out that it's not just the government, it's the government and private companies working together. Step two, assert that libertarianism can't handle this. Step three, move on. And just ignore, all the other shit that's like right in there with like, just like with so many of these other things, like we were talking about the other day with the domestic war on terrorism. It's like, and by the way, to their credit, I've seen some right wingers, some conservatives who have acknowledged this, but it's like, 20 years ago, the libertarians were the ones warning you guys about the Patriot Act and the war on terrorism and all of this stuff. And now that it's all blown up in your faces, you're like, oh shit, we got to be against this stuff. But yeah, libertarians, any good libertarians would have been fighting over the last 20, 30 years, all of this stuff being built up to begin with. Like we're the ones who wanted to completely, if you talk about like the financial companies shutting people down, well, yeah, it's a whole government monopoly system. So that's like what we've been against this whole time. Maybe you guys should have paid more attention to the Federal Reserve over the last 20 years. You know what I mean? Maybe that would have helped. Alex Jones, on the other hand, I think kind of did pay attention to the Federal Reserve. So I don't know where he's getting off to reject libertarianism because we're living under fascism.
So it almost sounds like your argument is we got to limit the scope and power of government, and maybe the argument he's making, but I'd give him the opportunity to clarify this, is like, we need a strong Republicans to take over the government and then do a better job of, instead of living in government, but using the power to fight off the left, but then you're still empowering government. Well, and right. And you both need to take control of it with some sort of super majority and then retain it and not have the left come back and try and push you back. But it seems like more of a fantasy.
Yes, exactly. And then like, it's like, is this even, and this is like a thing that people have to recognize, that like these institutions are like progressive by their very nature. And almost all of the institutions that like all of the progressive institutions, like from the original progressive era, really started off as quite socially conservative, at least by today's standards. Like if you look at what was being taught in public schools in 1950, you know what I mean? It wasn't like hippie shit. It was like socially conservative shit. And if you look at like, say, the FBI or something like that, they were all very like old school and conservative, but it all, deteriorated to where it is now. And that's because these institutions are by their very nature, like they're going to move more and more in a progressive direction. But again, I'm just saying, it's like, would Stephen Crowder or Alex Jones say, okay, so if there's this ability for, say, the government to instruct, American Express or whatever, or these, companies to shut down bank accounts of dissident thinkers, are you saying you want that power to use that against other people to shut down their bank accounts? Like, is that the argument that you're using here? Because, okay, if that is the argument you're using here, it's like, yeah, believe me, whether you control that or they control that, that's going to be pretty damn corrupting pretty quickly. That's not the society you want to live in. You want to live in the society where that just doesn't exist. Like, you want that abolished. You don't want that controlled by your team rather than the other team.